Have you ever been in the middle of doing something that you actually care about, and out of nowhere, a voice shows up and tells you it's not good enough? Have you ever noticed that sometimes the harshest thing you'll hear all day comes from inside your own head? Here's what I want you to know. That voice has a name, it has a history, and most importantly, it's not the truth about who you are. Today, we're going to look at one of the most misunderstood parts of the inner life, the critical voice that shows up uninvited, seems to know all your weak spots, and somehow still convinces you to listen to it. We're going to talk about where it comes from, why it actually makes sense that it's there, how to recognize it when it shows up, and most importantly, what you can start doing so it stops running your life. All right, let's start with the basics because I think this topic gets overcomplicated pretty fast. What is the inner critic really? In its simplest form, it's a voice or a pattern of thought that evaluates you. And not in a balanced, thoughtful way. It tends to be harsh, absolute, and personal. It doesn't just say, that didn't go well. It says things like, you're always like this, or of course you messed that up, or who do you think you're kidding? It's the mental narrator that frames your mistakes as character flaws, that compares you to other people and finds you lacking, that tells you to sit down, stay quiet, don't try, because trying means risking failure, and failure would prove what the voice has been saying all along. You know, we all have these voices in our head, and it can feel like when we're the one going through it, like we're alone with this and no one else ever has this. But there are a lot of scenarios where we have this situation happen to us. Maybe we had a conversation that didn't go well. We replay it in our heads and we say to ourselves, I knew I was going to do that. Or a creative project that we just didn't hit the mark on. Maybe if we're asking for something we want, we don't get it. Or looking in the mirror and comparing themselves on social media. All of those things are really difficult. There was an old sketch on Saturday Night Live, which I used to love, and it was this Stuart Smalley. And the most famous episode of it is when he has Michael Jordan on there. And he has people look in the mirror. He says, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and even if I don't put the ball in the basket every time, I'm still worthy kind of thing. And it's so funny because obviously Michael Jordan being, one of the best basketball players to ever play, but the fact is that self-esteem issue, that self-talk, something that we all do, and that's the reason those kinds of things exist. Those sketches hit a nerve with people. They're popular because everybody can relate, and that's really the key with it. So this isn't rare or unusual. Not nearly everybody has the same inner voice to some degree, and so it's super important that if you're feeling this or experiencing it, that it doesn't make you uniquely bad or and it doesn't make you flawed or anything like that. We're all in that same situation. So the voice is a thought versus the voice feeling like a fact. And that's the thing that's really the distinction to make. It's an opinion. And it isn't the accurate one. It's not an accurate depiction of who you are. The critic's statements feel true even when they aren't, but the reality of it is they aren't. So here's what makes this voice so hard to deal with. For most of us, it doesn't sound like an outsider attacking us. It sounds like us, like our own internal logic, like common sense. And that's actually part of what makes it worth paying attention to because a voice that feels that real, that familiar, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. So where does this voice come from in the first place? Well, the short version is this. It usually started as a protection. If you think about early life for a minute, we're all trying to figure out how to belong, how to be loved, how to be accepted, seen as capable, how to be not embarrassed and not left out. And at some point, most of us get a message, sometimes direct, sometimes subtle, that there's a version of us that's more acceptable than another version. Now, maybe you learn that achievement got you warmth, so you always want to achieve because you know that you get recognition. So the voice that pushes you to be perfect, it started off as a strategy for love. Maybe you learn that being too much made people uncomfortable. So the voice, that tells you to shrink, to stay quiet, take up less space, don't dominate all the conversations. That started as a strategy for belonging, so people would accept you. Explore the common origins without over explaining. The fact is here, we want to make sure that we understand it, and we want to make sure that we think about what it is in our past, whether it's through our parents or maybe our peer group or whatever else, that got us to the place that we are. But we also want to be able to evaluate that for its accuracy and for the things that don't make sense. And so, if you can find yourself in a situation like your critical or high expectation parents, maybe that's one thing that you dealt with, or early experiences of failure, humiliation, or rejection. Maybe you tried something and it didn't work out. So then your mind tells you, oh, that was really uncomfortable. We don't want to do that again. Chronic comparison, whether it's through you or somebody else. Maybe your parents compared you to your siblings or your teachers did. They compared you to your peers or the cultural ideals. So perfectionism becomes a coping strategy. Environments where vulnerability feels dangerous makes it really difficult and makes us want to protect. Our mind wants to protect us from it. And so it teaches us ways to go by unnoticed so we don't draw that extra attention. And obviously, nowadays, especially with social media, we absorb those messages from culture, social media, about who's enough, about what success looks like. And that bar is always rising. And that bar is, selectively cherry picked. You only see the bright parts of most people's lives. They're not going to share with you the struggles that they go through and the problems because that isn't exciting to people, right? They're going to share with you the stuff that looks really good and that makes them seem like everything they do, all the lights are green and it's all success all the time. So the critic wasn't born mean. And it's important to understand that it was never the design. It was built to help you. But the coping strategy that made sense at 9 years old might be doing real damage at 35, 45, 55, right? You know, it's super important here that we understand that while the origins of it were positive and came from a place of protecting us, if it's outlasted its usefulness and the narrative no longer helps and in some cases actually harms us, it's time to evaluate that and get rid of it. So I want to be clear about something. The fact that you have this voice says nothing bad about you. It says that you're human. It says that you've been through things. And it says some part of you has been trying, sometimes clumsily, sometimes loudly, to keep you safe. Look, the highest performing athletes in the world oftentimes have a competitive drive that is so intense. And if you really stop and break it down, in a lot of cases, it comes from insecurity, which is insane, right? I mean, they're the highest performing athletes in the world, but they're driven, driven, driven constantly. And it's that feeling of not being enough. It's that feeling that they can never, there's always another level. It's what makes them great, but it's that double edged sword because it's that voice in your head too. So the problem isn't the voice that it exists. The problem is when it becomes the loudest voice in the room and starts making decisions on your behalf. So, in terms of how this shows up in everyday life, maybe we were going to take a risk and we were going to do something. Talk to somebody, reach out to, a business colleague that we thought could be a good connection, or maybe we wanted to ask somebody on a date. And then our inner voice tells us, you know what? The last time you tried this, you got smacked down. People told you, oh, no, I'm not interested. Oh, go away, whatever. And so, to protect ourselves so we don't feel that pain again, it prevents us from taking that chance. Then we never know what would have been. And so that's a problem. And we don't want that to hold us back. Procrastinating on something meaningful because the fear of doing it badly becomes worse than the fear of not doing it. And oftentimes, because these are tied up in emotions, we don't ever get to a point where we actually consciously recognize what's going on. We just let that take control. You over explain or apologize constantly in conversations. I remember early in my life, I learned a lesson that I never forgot. Somebody said, when you give somebody a compliment and they start self effacing, oh, you shouldn't, oh, don't worry, oh, no, I don't really deserve. It sounds on the surface like, oh, that's a really nice thing to do because they're humble. The reality of it is, when they say it enough, it really starts to have that effect on everyone around them too. Maybe they don't deserve it. Maybe they aren't that good. But all that is a defense. And so I learned, if somebody compliments you, the best thing to do is just say thank you. Thank you. That's it. You acknowledge the fact that somebody recognized something in you and you accept it. That's all you've got to do. And so if we're replaying past interactions for hours and editing what we should have said, or we're shrinking our ambitions before we even voice them because it's probably not going to work anyway, our ideas are usually dumb, they never come to pass. Maybe we feel a quick jolt of shame when you see somebody else succeed and you feel like, struggling to receive a compliment without immediately deflecting or dismissing it, as I mentioned, right? And that low grade sense of not quite enough that hums in the background, even when things are going okay. The point is, this voice doesn't just show up in big dramatic moments. It's active in small everyday choices, which means it affects compound quietly over time. And here's what I think is one of the most important distinctions to understand. There's a real difference between honest self-reflection and self-attack. Healthy self-reflection looks inward and asks, what happened here and what can I learn? The inner critic looks inward and says, see, this is just who you are. One wants to grow, the other wants to condemn. One is useful, the other is just pain dressed up as insight. And so when we let this run unchecked, I don't want to dwell here too long because this episode is ultimately about possibility, not just problems. But we need to name this honestly. When this voice runs unchecked, when we treat it as commentary, as accurate and final, the costs are real. We make ourselves smaller than we actually are. We avoid risks that might have changed our lives. We stay in relationships, jobs, and patterns that feel safe to the critic, but quietly suffocating to the rest of us. We become, over time, the person the voice said we were. Not because it was right, but because we never stopped to question it. There's an emotional toll involved with this. Anxiety, low self-worth, chronic overthinking, difficulty trusting yourself, exhaustion from the constant internal judgment. All of those things are very real. But that unchecked critic, it coexists with an outward appearance of having it together. A lot of those high achievers are quietly being run ragged by this voice, as I mentioned with the athletes. Internally, they cannot slow down. It's not that they're this amazing athlete and they just want to keep achieving more. There's an unhealthy thing underneath all of it that they haven't been able to reconcile in a lot of cases. And so here's the thing. None of that is fixed. This is all workable, and that's the beauty of it. So what do we actually do? And I want to be honest with you here. There's no hack that makes the voice disappear. Anyone promising that is selling you something. What's real is this. You can change your relationship to the voice. You can learn to hear it without being controlled by it. And that shift changes everything. So let me walk you through a few ways to start. The first thing is to notice it. The first step sounds really simple, but it's genuinely powerful. Notice when the voice is speaking. Most of us are so identified with this inner narrator that we don't realize we're listening to it. We think that we're just thinking. There's a difference between thinking and being thought at. So start paying attention to the emotional signature of the critic. A tightening, a sinking feeling, a sudden urge to quit or hide. That's often the body responding to the voice before the mind catches up. So when you feel a sharp dip in how you feel about yourself, especially in response to a mistake, comparison, or feedback, that's a really good moment to ask, wait, what just got said in there? The goal of noticing isn't to stop the thought. It's to create even a tiny bit of distance from it. And we want to name it without fusing with it. Once you notice it, try naming it, not in a dismissive way, but just to create a little separation. Instead of, I'm such an idiot, try, there's that voice again. Or even just, that's the critic. That small shift from I am to there's a thought is actually profound. Because you can observe a thought, you can question a thought, you can decide what to do with a thought. But when you're fully fused with it, when the thought is you, you have no room to move. So some people find it helpful to give the voice an actual name. You can call it your alter ego or whatever, imagine it as a character. You can separate it from yourself that way. It's not weird. It's a way of creating that distance. Now, the point isn't to mock or hate the voice. It's to stop treating it as the oracle. Then we want to get curious about what it's protecting. Here's where things get really interesting in this. Once you've created a little space between you and that voice, you can start asking a different kind of question. Not, is this voice right? But what is this voice afraid of? Because underneath most inner criticism is fear: fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as not good enough, fear that trying and failing would be worse than never trying at all. I can tell you, I know a lot of very successful people. And the number of them, when you get them in a quiet moment and talk about them, that suffer from imposter syndrome and always wonder if they're enough, despite the fact that outwardly everything looks amazing, is stunning and absolutely astounding. And when you understand the fear underneath the attack, something starts to soften. So, this isn't about convincing yourself that the critic is wrong. It's about understanding what it's trying to do and then deciding if that approach is actually helping. So, as an example, if the voice says to you, don't speak up in that meeting, the fear underneath might be, what if I say something dumb and they judge me? That fear is worth understanding. The solution voice proposes, silence might not actually serve you. If you never speak up in meetings, how are you ever going to stand out? Now, this step is going to take practice and it's worth being patient with yourself. Then we want to challenge distorted thinking. So, not all self critical thoughts are completely wrong, but many are distorted. So if we think about something, where it's all or nothing, right? I'm completely failing at this. When in reality, maybe parts are going fine. The overall result might not be what you want, but you're actually doing really well in some areas. And if it's something new that you've done, anything is progress. If you've taken a risk to do it, that's progress. Maybe I always do this, when it's actually just one specific situation that when you separate it out, there's not really a pattern there at all. It just feels like there is. Or, everyone could tell I was nervous. In most cases, it's completely untrue. If you've ever done public speaking, you can find that people are very nervous and it never shows. Because if that nervous energy is channeled in the right way, you don't see it anyway. I remember hearing an interview with a very, very famous, like Grammy Award winning superstar musician. And they asked her, how often do you feel nervous? Or, do you ever feel nervous going on stage? And she said, every time. I've been doing this for 30 years and I get butterflies in my stomach and I get totally nervous. I'm a nervous wreck before I go on stage. And they said, how do you deal with it? And she said, well, I just go on stage and once I start performing, it all melts away. But here's somebody who's at the top of their field, recognizable by everybody, and yet in a situation where every single time they go on stage, the crowd loves them. You already know this. They're not an opening act. And even still nervous every single time. Another thing you might say to yourself is, this is going to ruin everything. Usually that's an exaggeration. We are blowing up something into something much larger than it actually is, and we just need to compartmentalize and realize it isn't as big as we think. So the question to ask is, if a close friend said this about themselves, would you accept it as the truth? Usually the answer is no, and we deserve the same standard for ourselves. So you want to make sure that you aren't fighting the critic, but you're checking the facts. And then we want to replace attack with compassionate honesty. And here's something that I think gets misunderstood. The goal here isn't toxic positivity. We're not talking about like, hey, everything's great, no matter what happens. It's about replacing you messed up with everything is perfect and you're amazing. The goal is to be honest and kind at the same time, because those two things aren't opposites. You can acknowledge that something didn't go well without weaponizing it against yourself. You can hold yourself accountable without hating yourself for being human. Compassionate honesty sounds like, that didn't land the way I hoped. What can I learn? What do I want to do differently next time? Not, oh, that was terrible. I'm terrible. Why do I even try? So think about how you talk to someone you love who made the same mistake, because that tone is the model. Would you treat them that way, or would you give them a lot more compassion? Because compassion doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means being a good coach to yourself instead of a bad one. And then we want to act from our values even when that critic is loud. Finally, and maybe the most Important thing that I can say. You don't have to wait for the critic to be quiet before you live your life. The voice may never fully disappear, but you can learn to move forward with it present rather than waiting for permission from it that may never come. When you act from your values, not from fear, not from the voice's opinion, but from what actually matters to you, you slowly build evidence that the critic's verdict was never the final word. So, this is a super important topic. And I think it's very important to have an understanding, but also to be patient with ourselves at the same time. So I want to leave you with something to sit with. The inner critic is not your enemy. It's part of you that got scared and never quite found a better way to cope. It speaks harshly because somewhere along the way, that felt like the safest option. But you are not just that voice. You never were. You're also the part that still tries, the part that wonders and hopes and shows up even when it's hard, the part that's listening right now, looking for a better way to live. That part, the one that wants more than the critic has been willing to allow, that's the part worth listening to.